What if the greatest civilizations in human history didn't collapse in fire, war, or disaster, but simply stood up and left? Across the world, archaeologists keep finding the same disturbing pattern. Homes where meals were half finished, tools abandoned where hands last touched them, walls still bearing symbols meant to be seen. Life was here, and then it wasn't. No final battle, no mass graves, no clear reason. Entire cultures vanished not with screams, but with silence. And that silence is unsettling because it feels intentional. These were not primitive societies. They planned, built, believed, and understood their world deeply. Yet something made them walk away from everything they knew. Tonight, we step into those unanswered moments, into the spaces where history stops explaining itself. Because when a civilization disappears quietly, the question isn't just what happened. It's what do they know that made them leave? In the quiet hours of the night, when the world softens and our thoughts slow into gentler rhythms, history begins to feel less like a distant archive and more like a living presence, drifting somewhere just beyond the edges of memory. It is in these subdued, half-lit moments that we can sense how delicate the story of humanity truly is, how entire cultures, once full of voices, footsteps, and dreams, can slip away with almost no warning, as though carried off by a silent wind. The past is not as solid as we imagine. It is a tapestry woven from fragments, from guesses, from symbols carved into fading stone. And the thread that binds it together is astonishingly thin. This opening chapter invites us into a world where knowledge and mystery coexist, overlapping like shadows at dusk. For every well-documented empire, for every culture whose artifacts line the halls of museums, there are countless others that exist only in faint traces, scattered pottery shards, abandoned dwellings, clues whose meanings have been stripped away by time. Some of these cultures disappeared gradually, dissolving over generations, but others vanished so suddenly, so completely, that their absence still unsettles us. They leave behind not a story, but a question. A quiet question, but a persistent one. Imagine a thriving settlement. Families tending to fires, artisans shaping their creations, children learning the patterns of the world. Then imagine all of it ending, not slowly but swiftly. No final battle, no dramatic catastrophe etched into the earth. Just a moment where life was present, and the next moment where life had moved on. These are the vanishings that whisper through archaeological sites across the globe. They resist explanation, as though they were never meant to be fully understood. There's a certain gentleness to their disappearance, but also an undeniable strangeness, like a story that cuts off before the last page. As we begin this calm journey, we will step softly into the spaces these cultures left behind. This is not a journey of excitement or urgency, but of curiosity. Slow, patient curiosity that mirrors the steady uncovering of soil by archaeologists brushing away centuries of dust. We will explore the contrasts that define these mysteries, the brightness of what we know against the darkness of what we cannot recover, the solidity of ancient structures against the fleeting nature of the people who built them, the certainty of our modern perspective against the vast unknowns of the ancient world. And yet, even as we acknowledge the unknown, there is comfort here. For the unknown gives history its depth. It reminds us that humanity's story is far larger and more intricate than what has survived on paper. The silence these cultures left behind is not empty. It is full of possibility. It invites imagination without demanding conclusions. In a way, these sudden vanishings help us rest, because they loosen our need for certainty. They remind us that not everything must be resolved, and not every mystery must be solved. In this first moment of the documentary, we allow our senses to settle. The pace is slow, intentionally so, gently guiding listeners into an atmosphere where facts flow like calm water and mysteries drift like soft clouds. We begin to sense how fragile human memory truly is, how civilizations depend not only on their achievements, but on the survival of their stories. Without storytelling, Even the greatest cultures can become whispers in the wind. And once forgotten, they live only in the faint patterns they leave behind. It is this fragility that makes the sudden disappearances we will explore so haunting and so compelling. Some cultures endure in stories long after their last stones have fallen. Others, despite complex societies and remarkable creations, fade without explanation. Their departure feels like a candle being extinguished in a quiet room. No sound, no announcement, only the soft shift from light to shadow. One moment, they are part of the world's heartbeat. The next, they belong to the silence beneath our feet. As we move deeper into this journey, we'll follow that silence to places where human presence once flourished. We'll walk through ancient doorways that open onto empty rooms, stand beside structures that no longer echo with human voices, and trace the outlines of cultures that withdrew from history so quickly that their absence feels almost intentional. Our steps will be unhurried, our tone gentle, our mind open to possibilities. In the calm of this night, you may imagine the archaeologists of today brushing their tools across stone, hoping to hear echoes of what has been lost. You might picture a landscape untouched for centuries, grass reclaiming old pathways, the wind carrying fragments of stories that can no longer be fully told. These images, soft, distant, dreamlike, set the tone for everything that follows. And as this introductory section draws to its close, the path ahead becomes clearer, yet remains wrapped in mystery. We are about to visit the first of these ancient cultures, a Neolithic community whose sudden silence still puzzles every researcher who studies it. A place where art, life, and ritual once thrived, and then fell quiet almost at once. With a gentle breath, we step forward. The journey begins. In the heart of Anatolia, surrounded by plains that stretch gently toward the horizon, lies the ancient settlement of Catalhook, a place that once pulsed with life more than 9,000 years ago. Today it rests in stillness, a mound of layered earth and faded memories. But in its time it was a thriving community, unusual in its structure, rich in symbolism, and unexpectedly sophisticated for its age. As we enter this section of our journey, we walk softly into one of the earliest known urban centers, a place where humanity first experimented with what it meant to live together, to create, to share, and eventually to leave. And the leaving, in this case, is the quiet enigma that shapes this entire chapter. Catalhoyuk was not a typical settlement. Its houses were clustered so closely together that they touched like pieces in an intricate puzzle. There were no streets, no open pathways. People moved across rooftops, climbing down ladders directly into their homes. Imagine a community where the sky acted as the main highway, where daily life was lived along the sunlit surfaces instead of ground level. This unusual arrangement gives Catalhoyuk a dreamlike quality, almost as if the settlement existed slightly apart from the usual flow of ancient life. Each home was a small world of its own. White plaster walls, painted murals, carefully arranged platforms, and, often, burials placed beneath the floors. Inside these homes, the people of Catalhoyuk expressed themselves through vibrant art. Their walls were covered with images of animals, geometric shapes, and mysterious scenes whose meanings we can only guess. Bulls were a recurring symbol, their horns carefully mounted and preserved, suggesting a spirituality we cannot fully decode. There were figurines, too, some stylized, some realistic, depicting goddesses, animals, and perhaps ancestors. Everything hints at a rich, layered belief system, one that intertwined daily tasks with profound rituals. It was a world where the ordinary and the sacred coexisted without a sharp line dividing them. And yet, as impressive as Catalhoyuk was, what makes it so compelling in the context of this documentary is not just its life, but its quiet disappearance. For centuries, the settlement grew and flourished. It survived changing climates, evolving practices, and the slow accumulation of history. Then, in what seems like an unexpectedly swift moment, it was abandoned. Not destroyed, not violently overturned, simply left behind, as though the people made a collective decision to depart and never return. Archaeologists searching for the reason behind this departure find no signs of war, no skeletons bearing marks of conflict, no burned layers that would indicate sudden destruction. There are no collapsed walls from earthquakes, no overwhelming evidence of famine or plague. Instead, Catalhoch's final layers give the impression of a slow but deliberate withdrawal. The once vibrant murals stop appearing. The architecture becomes simpler, less expressive. Rituals that once defined the settlement fade from the archaeological record. It feels as if a spiritual or cultural shift quietly swept through the community, a change we can sense but not fully articulate. One theory suggests that environmental stress may have played a role. The land around Catalhoyuk may have become less fertile with time, prompting families to spread outward in search of better resources. Another possibility is social evolution. As neighboring regions advanced and new ideas circulated, the people of Catalhoyuk may have restructured their lives in ways that no longer fit the settlement's dense, rooftop-connected layout. They may have moved toward more open community structures, embracing new forms of agriculture, trade, or belief that simply did not belong to the world they had built on that mound. Yet what deepens the mystery is the absence of a clear trail. Many ancient cultures leave behind signs of where their people migrated next. But Catalhoch's inhabitants dissolved into the surrounding region without leaving a distinct successor culture. Their artistic traditions do not appear fully formed in nearby areas. Their architectural style, so unique and recognizable, does not persist into later settlements. It's as if this entire way of life simply ended, like a candle extinguished between one breath and the next. Walking through the excavation site today, one can almost hear the quiet hum of the past beneath the stillness. The rooms, now exposed to the sky, feel like stages whose actors left long ago. Platforms that once held resting bodies now hold only sunlight and dust. The bull horns, weathered and fragile, watch over spaces where no rituals are performed anymore. There is a gentle melancholy here, not a harsh sense of tragedy, but a soft, lingering sense of absence. Something once thrived, something once mattered deeply, and then it faded without leaving a clear explanation. To imagine the settlement in its final days is to picture a place slowly losing its spark. Perhaps some families left first, carrying only what they needed. Perhaps others hesitated, staying a little longer, maintaining the old traditions until they became too heavy to continue. Maybe there were conversations whispered inside those plastered rooms, discussions of change, of new possibilities, of uncertainty. Or perhaps there was no great emotional weight at all. Perhaps the departure was simply a practical shift, unnoticed by the world at large, but monumental in the timeline of human history. The truth is hidden, layered within the soil, protected by time. And yet, even in their absence, the people of Catalhoch left behind a profound gift, a glimpse into the earliest chapters of settled human life. They showed us that long before empires rose, long before written language shaped human memory, there were people experimenting with community, art, spirituality, and identity. Their disappearance reminds us how fragile the thread of continuity can be. A thriving culture can vanish not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet decision, one so gentle that it leaves behind no scars, only questions. As we leave Catalhoyuk behind in this documentary journey, we carry with us both the richness of what they created and the mystery of why they left it. The path forward leads us into the patterns that might connect their story with others across the ancient world. For Catalhoyuk is just the first whisper, a reminder that humanity's earliest experiments with settled life were as unpredictable and enigmatic as the winds that now sweep across its abandoned walls. With this quiet departure in mind, we step into the next section, where we pull back from a single settlement and begin to look for broader patterns in these sudden vanishings, patterns that may illuminate what connects these puzzling stories across continents and eras. As we step away from the intimate rooms and rooftop pathways of Catalhoyuk, The landscape of history stretches out wider before us. No longer focused on a single settlement, we begin to look at the ancient world as a mosaic of places where life blossomed, shifted, and sometimes disappeared without a trace. This section becomes a gentle bridge, an unhurried reflection that invites us to consider the broader patterns behind human vanishings, the faint rhythms that echo across time and continents. It is not a search for hard answers, but an exploration of how these mysteries weave together into something larger, something quietly profound. Across the early chapters of human civilization, disappearances are not unusual. Cultures rise, flourish, and eventually decline. But what draws our attention in this documentary are the cases where the pace of that decline becomes unexpectedly quick, almost instantaneous when measured on the scale of centuries. Catalhoyuk is one such example, but it is far from alone. When we pause and observe the early world with a wide lens, we notice that these vanishings tend to occur along the fragile border between human intention and environmental change. In many ancient settlements, shifting climates force communities to move, adapt, or dissolve. Rivers change their courses, transforming fertile farmlands into barren stretches. Lakes dried up or overflowed. Forests retreated and deserts expanded. These natural adjustments were subtle to the earth, but devastating to the societies that depended on the land for survival. And yet, even in cases where environmental stress played a role, there are disappearances that remain difficult to explain. Why do some settlements reorganize and rebuild, while others seem to quietly abandon everything, leaving behind a silence so complete that it feels deliberate? Perhaps part of the answer lies in the cultures themselves, how they were structured, what they valued, and how they interpreted change. Some communities were tightly bound by shared rituals or beliefs that held them together until disruption became too great to overcome. Others may have been more fluid, ready to disperse when opportunities shifted. And in some cases, we suspect migrations, but the trails are so faint that they blend back into the surrounding populations without leaving a strong archaeological footprint. It is as if people dissolved into the wider human landscape, like a handful of sand disappearing into the shore. There's also the possibility that many of these vanishings were not tragedies, but transitions. The disappearance of a settlement does not always mean the disappearance of a culture. People may have moved somewhere new, adopted new customs, or merged with neighboring groups. From our modern perspective, the sudden absence of artifacts and structures can feel dramatic, even alarming. But for the people themselves, it may have been an ordinary decision made in the quiet flow of life. A decision that later generations, lacking context, interpret as a mystery. As we reflect on these patterns, a more subtle theme begins to emerge: the fragility of the archaeological record itself. For every site that survives long enough to be studied, countless others have eroded away, reclaimed by rivers, forests, and time. What we see today is only a sliver of ancient reality. This means that some sudden disappearances may not be disappearances at all, but simply stories that have lost their final chapters to nature's slow, steady hand. Our understanding is shaped as much by what the earth preserves as by what it chooses to erase. And yet, despite these explanations, environmental, social, archaeological, there are still vanishings that resist all interpretation. Settlements that leave behind no clear reason for their abandonment. Cultures that vanish so quickly and so completely that all we can do is sit with the silence they left behind. It is in these cases that mystery begins to eclipse history, where facts blur just enough to invite wonder. These are the mysteries that connect our curiosity across the ages, linking Catalhoyuk with countless other lost worlds. As this gentle bridge reaches its end, the path ahead becomes more defined. We leave the broad reflections and step toward the next great enigma. A culture whose disappearance is intertwined with the collapse of entire empires, yet whose own origins and fate remain shrouded in uncertainty. They appeared suddenly, shook the ancient world, and then vanished with equal speed. With a quiet breath, we turn toward the story of the Sea Peoples, the next thread in this tapestry of sudden disappearances. In the late Bronze Age, when empires stretched confidently across the Mediterranean and trade routes linked distant lands in glittering networks, the ancient world felt stable, almost predictable. Cities glowed with prosperity, palaces hummed with activity, and kingdoms believed in the permanence of their own power. Yet into this seemingly ordered world came a force that shattered everything with stunning speed. The enigmatic group known today as the Sea Peoples. They appeared suddenly, struck with unprecedented coordination, and then dissolved into obscurity just as abruptly, leaving behind a trail of destruction, unanswered questions, and a silence that continues to echo through history. To understand why the Sea Peoples are considered one of history's great mysteries, we must first imagine the world they entered. Egypt stood strong along the Nile, its legacy ancient even then. The Hittite Empire thrived in Anatolia with its fierce warriors and advanced diplomacy. Mycenaean Greece, with its fortified citadels, ruled the Aegean. Cyprus, Syria, and Canaan formed the links of a rich chain of cultures connected by trade, language, and maritime exchange. Across this region, ships carried copper, tin, ivory, ceramics, and ideas. It was a world of movement and connection, a world that believed its rhythm would continue forever. And then, almost without warning, that rhythm changed. Around the 12th century BCE, inscriptions, letters, and archaeological layers began to speak of upheaval. Cities burned, palaces collapsed, trade networks snapped like fragile threads. Entire regions seemed to fall into darkness. In the midst of this collapse, ancient scribes began describing invaders coming from the sea, arriving in great numbers, destroying everything in their path. These groups were not familiar armies from neighboring kingdoms. They were outsiders, unnamed, unrecognized, and unstoppable. They came in ships, entire families aboard, carrying not only weapons but, it seemed, their households, livestock, and hopes for new land. They were later called the Sea Peoples, a modern name, because the ancient world never agreed on what to call them. Different records list different tribes: Sherdin, Shikalesh, Lucca, Peleset, Dinyan, Tjeker, and others. Were these separate groups who formed an alliance? Or were they fragments of displaced populations moving in waves? No one knows. Their identity remains a puzzle, their language unknown, their origins debated endlessly. Some believe they came from the Aegean or Western Anatolia. Others suspect they originated in Europe, the Balkans, or even the Central Mediterranean. The truth remains hidden in the same fog that surrounds their disappearance. The Sea Peoples were powerful enough to topple or weaken some of the most advanced civilizations of their time. The Hittite Empire, with its diplomatic brilliance and military might, vanished from history shortly after their onslaught. Cities across the Levant were reduced to ashes. Mycenaean palaces crumbled into ruins. Ugarit, a thriving port city with archives filled with cuneiform tablets, was destroyed so completely that its final messages, letters pleading for aid, never reached their destination. Archaeology shows widespread destruction across multiple regions, all occurring within a strikingly short time frame. And yet, this is where the paradox deepens. For a force powerful enough to disrupt the entire eastern Mediterranean, the Sea Peoples left no homeland to trace, no central capital, no consistent style of writing, architecture, or religion. They left almost nothing behind except destruction, and then, suddenly, they too vanished. For a moment, they were the storm that shook the ancient world, and then they were gone, absorbed into the silence that followed. The Egyptians under Pharaoh Ramesses III claimed a rare victory against them, recording a great battle fought on land and sea. In this battle, artists carved dramatic scenes of foreign ships overturned, warriors swimming for their lives, and chariots charging through the chaos. The inscriptions described the invaders as desperate, bringing their families in ox-drawn carts, seeking new places to dwell. Egypt repelled them, barely. But after this clash, the Sea Peoples recede from the historical record. They left a shock wave behind them, but the people themselves evaporated from history. Their disappearance is as puzzling as their appearance. How could a force capable of ending an era simply vanish? Theories attempt to fill the silence. Some suggest these groups were refugees fleeing climate change, famine, or earthquakes in their homelands. Others believe they were disbanded warriors from collapsing regions, looking for stability. Another possibility is that they did not disappear. Rather, they were absorbed into the cultures they impacted. The Pele set, for example, are often linked to the Philistines of later biblical records. The Shurdin may have settled in regions that later became Sardinia. But even these connections remain uncertain, their origins blurred by time. What fascinates historians is the dual nature of their mystery. They caused disappearances, but they also became a disappearance themselves. They were a vanishing force that ultimately vanished. Their story is like a wave that rises suddenly, crashes loudly, and then withdraws silently, leaving the shore forever changed. This duality fits beautifully into the contrast between known and unknown that shapes this documentary. They are a reminder that history is not a straight line. It is a weaving of disruptions, migrations, and inexplicable movements that escape our attempts to categorize them neatly. When we explore the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, it becomes clear that the Sea Peoples were not the sole cause. Famine, climate shifts, internal rebellions, and weakening political structures all contributed. But the Sea Peoples remain the haunting symbol of that collapse. The face of the storm, the embodiment of everything that changed too quickly to be fully understood. Their disappearance, ironically, mirrors the collapse they helped initiate. Once the chaos settled, many of the old kingdoms were gone, replaced by smaller, scattered communities. Writing systems changed. Trade diminished. It took centuries for the region to recover. Imagine sailing across the Mediterranean during those years of turmoil. Coastlines once illuminated by grand cities would have appeared dark, abandoned, eerily quiet. Harbors once filled with merchant ships would have sat empty. And somewhere, among those darkened waters, the Sea People's ships would have drifted, formidable, nomadic, and without a clear destination. Their identities may have shifted with each journey, each battle, each settlement attempt. The sea was their home, and the sea, in the end, may have swallowed their story. As we reflect on the Sea Peoples, we see an image that is both powerful and gentle, a force of change that came and went like a distant storm system, shaping the world but refusing to be pinned down by history. Their brief but impactful presence reminds us how vulnerable even the strongest civilizations can be, and how easily a group can slip from global influence into complete obscurity. Now, as this section draws to a quiet close, we allow the waves of their story to settle. The world they shook eventually rebuilt itself, adopting new forms and new identities. But their mystery remains a reminder that some chapters of history will always drift just out of reach, carried across time like unanswered whispers. With that lingering sense of both awe and uncertainty, we turn next to a very different enigma, one found not on the Mediterranean shores, but deep within the ancient landscapes of North America. Our next culture did not arrive in a storm. Instead, they built with patience and precision before disappearing just as quietly. And so, we drift gently toward the builders of Poverty Point. In the quiet heart of North America, along the winding stretches of the lower Mississippi Valley, lies a monumental site that feels both ancient and strangely untouched by time. It is known today as Poverty Point, a name that obscures the immense sophistication and mystery that rests beneath its gentle, grass-covered slopes. Here, thousands of years ago, long before the rise of classical civilizations, long before written language reached this land, a people constructed vast earthworks with a precision and purpose that still baffles researchers. They rose abruptly in history, flourished with remarkable skill, and then disappeared so completely that we do not even know what they called themselves. As we enter this section, We step onto a landscape shaped not by stone temples or towering monuments, but by sweeping arcs of earth, arranged in rings that stretch across the terrain like a cosmic design. At first glance, the sight seems almost natural, gentle ridges and mounds blending into the surrounding fields. But as you observe more closely, you begin to see patterns. 6 concentric ridges forming a vast semicircle, massive earthen mounds rising above the horizon, and pathways that hint at intentional planning rather than chance. This was a place built with care, coordination, and extraordinary vision. The people of Poverty Point lived around 1500 BCE, making their culture older than many of the world's iconic civilizations. Yet unlike the Egyptians or Mesopotamians, they left behind no writing, no carved records, no royal tombs, and no clear evidence of a ruling class. What they did leave is something more subtle and almost more haunting: architectural expressions of purpose and meaning carved into the earth itself. For reasons we can only imagine, they shaped their world with sweeping gestures, as though drawing symbols large enough for the sky to witness. These earthworks were massive undertakings. To create them, the builders moved nearly 1 million cubic meters of soil using only baskets, hands, and determination. No evidence suggests they used draft animals or advanced tools. Every ridge, every curve, was crafted through human effort alone. And yet the layout of the site reveals a level of planning that suggests a deep understanding of geometry, community organization, and perhaps even astronomy. Some researchers believe the ridges may have served as gathering places, marketplaces, or ceremonial structures. Others propose that the alignment of the mounds connects to solar or lunar cycles. Regardless of their exact purpose, the scale and precision of Poverty Point show that the people who built it were far from simple. Their trade networks were equally astonishing. Artifacts found at the site include stones from the Great Lakes, minerals from the Appalachian Mountains, copper from distant regions, and exotic materials carried from hundreds of miles away. This suggests that the builders of Poverty Point were not isolated. They were connected deeply and intentionally to a wide web of communities across the continent. The goods they collected were carefully shaped into beads, tools, and finely crafted objects that must have held meaning beyond mere function. Among the most intriguing discoveries are small clay objects, sometimes figurines, sometimes mysterious shapes, whose purposes remain unknown. Despite their complexity, the people of Poverty Point left few traces of daily domestic life. Archaeologists find almost no evidence of permanent houses. This leads to several possibilities. Maybe the structures were made from materials that decayed completely, or perhaps life was organized differently, more fluid, more communal, more temporary. The site may have been a ceremonial center where people gathered periodically rather than a place where everyone lived year-round. Or it may have offered a blend of both, a home for some, a sacred gathering place for many more. Yet even with all these insights, the greatest question still lingers. Why did this remarkable culture disappear? After centuries of activity, the earthworks fell silent. The trade networks ceased. The gathering places emptied. There is no sign of warfare, no evidence of crisis or destruction. It is as if the people gently withdrew from the site and simply never returned. The land reclaimed what they left behind, softening the edges of their monumental architecture until, from a distance, it blended seamlessly with the natural world. One theory points toward environmental change. Shifts in the Mississippi River's course could have disrupted the ecosystem, altering resources or accessibility. But environmental change rarely causes such sudden cultural silence on its own. Another theory suggests social transformation. Perhaps new cultural practices emerged that made the site less significant. Or internal leadership structures may have shifted, guiding the people toward a new way of life in other locations. Some archaeologists propose that Poverty Point's significance as a ceremonial hub may have declined gradually as traditions evolved and new centers emerged elsewhere. But there is another possibility, gentler and more enigmatic, that the disappearance was intentional. Perhaps the site fulfilled its purpose, whatever that purpose was, and when its spiritual or cultural role had been completed, the people moved on. In this interpretation, the silence of Poverty Point is not tragic, but peaceful. The builders finished what they came to build. The gatherings concluded, and the community dispersed, carrying their traditions into unknown corners of the region. Walking through Poverty Point today, the atmosphere feels serene, almost meditative. Birds drift above the ridges. Grass sways softly across the mounds. The vast semicircles create a sensation of standing inside an ancient, open-air amphitheater designed not for spectacle, but for connection. Connection to one another, to the land, to the rhythms of the sky. There is no sense of collapse here, no echo of violence. Only the quiet after a long, purposeful journey. The disappearance of Poverty Point's builders embodies the contrast at the heart of this documentary. A people capable of creating something monumental, yet choosing, or being compelled, to leave it behind without explanation. Their legacy is a whisper held in the shape of the land, a reminder that not all great cultures announce themselves loudly. Some speak softly, through earth and silence, long after their voices have faded. As we prepare to leave this mysterious site, we carry with us a sense of awe for their accomplishment and a lingering curiosity for the unknown chapter that followed. Poverty Point reminds us that ancient North America was rich with genius, vision, and storytelling, even if those stories were not written in words. And so, with this gentle puzzle resting in our thoughts, we step into the next bridge of our journey. Here, we reflect once more on landscapes and how they outlive the people who shaped them, guiding us toward the next mystery waiting quietly in the ancient world. As we move away from the sweeping arcs and silent mounds of Poverty Point, the world around us seems to widen into a deeper, quieter reflection. The site we leave behind reminds us of something profound. Landscapes endure far longer than the cultures that shape them. Rivers shift their paths, forests thicken or retreat, coastlines rise and fall. And through all of these changes, human presence drifts like a temporary melody over the Earth's ancient rhythm. This bridge section invites us to linger in that thought, to let the interplay between land and people settle softly in our minds before we journey onward to the next vanished culture. Imagine standing on a landscape that has seen thousands of generations come and go. The earth beneath your feet remembers footsteps long forgotten. Hills retain the faint outlines of structures that once stood proudly, but have since melted back into the soil. The wind carries no names, only impressions, as if the memory of those who lived there has dissolved into the natural world. In many ways, landscapes are the final guardians of human stories, preserving fragments while allowing the rest to fade into the backdrop of time. Throughout history, we see this pattern again and again. A community flourishes in harmony with its environment, building according to its resources, sustaining itself through rivers, forests, plains, or coasts. But when those environments shift, even slightly, entire ways of life can become unsettled. A river's course changes, and farmlands are suddenly too dry. A coastline erodes, and settlements must move inland. Forests grow thicker, pushing communities to relocate. To us today, these changes may seem small, but to the people living through them, they were world-altering. And yet, the disappearances we explore in this documentary are not always tied to environmental catastrophe. Sometimes the change is subtle, almost gentle. A culture simply outgrows the land, or the land no longer aligns with its evolving needs. People adapt, move, or transform, but the landscape remains, holding the outlines of their existence like a ghostly imprint. Poverty Point is one such example, an immense effort shaped into the earth, now softened by time, yet unmistakably present. The people have gone, but the land speaks in their stead. What deepens the beauty of this reality is that landscapes become storytellers without words. A mound, a ridge, a terrace, a forgotten foundation, all whisper of lives once intertwined with the soil. These remnants do not give us direct answers, but they evoke questions, emotions, and a quiet form of respect. They remind us that we are temporary guests on Earth's surface, borrowing its contours for our own stories before returning them to the flow of time. As we reflect on these patterns, a gentle understanding emerges. Disappearances are often a conversation between people and their environment. Sometimes people retreat before environmental pressures. Sometimes they move in search of spiritual renewal or opportunities beyond the horizon. And sometimes they leave intentionally, sensing that their connection to the land has reached its natural conclusion. This bridge also prepares us for what comes next, a shift from the wide plains and river valleys of North America to the glittering coastline of the ancient Aegean. There, another culture once thrived with brilliance and grace, leaving behind palaces so intricate they seem to hold entire worlds within their walls. Just like the landscapes we've reflected upon, the islands of the Mediterranean have outlived countless civilizations, standing as silent witnesses to rise and decline. And so, with this quiet contemplation resting gently in our thoughts, we step toward the next chapter. Ahead lies the story of the Minoans, a civilization of art, architecture, and maritime splendor, one that shone brightly before fading into history's soft shadows. Among the shimmering islands of the Aegean Sea, the Minoan civilization once glowed with an elegance that still feels otherworldly. Their palaces were not fortresses, but airy labyrinths filled with light, color, and flowing frescoes that danced across walls like frozen stories. Their ships moved across the sea like quiet ambassadors, connecting Crete with distant cultures in a rhythm of trade and artistry. And their society, unusually peaceful for its era, created an environment where creativity seemed to flourish freely. Yet despite all this brilliance, the Minoans vanished with startling swiftness, their palaces abandoned, their rituals silenced, and their legacy left drifting between myth and memory. This section gently sinks into the heart of their mystery, exploring a disappearance that still feels profound thousands of years later. When we imagine ancient Crete at its height, we might picture the Palace of Knossos, with its multi-level halls, vibrant murals, and an architectural style so advanced it almost feels modern. There were no defensive walls surrounding these structures, an unusual choice in a world where most cities fortified themselves. Instead, the Minoans seemed confident in the natural protection offered by their island position and in their strong diplomatic relationships. Their art reflects scenes of everyday life, ritual dances, and marine imagery rather than warfare. Even their script, known as linear, remains undeciphered, lending an additional veil of secrecy to their beliefs, languages, and records. And then, somewhere around 1450 BCE, everything changed. Archaeologists have long debated what triggered the Minoan sudden collapse. One of the most dramatic theories centers on the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern-day Santorini, one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history. When Thera exploded, it unleashed a plume of ash that darkened skies across the Mediterranean. Massive tsunamis swept through the Aegean, devastating coastal settlements, including Minoan harbors that formed the lifeline of their trade network. The atmospheric effects may have altered climate patterns, changing harvests for years. Standing on the shores of Crete today, it is easy to imagine how such an event could shake the stability of even the most thriving society. But the mystery becomes deeper when we look closer. The eruption occurred earlier than the final disappearance of the Minoans, meaning it alone cannot explain everything. The destruction layers at many Minoan sites show signs of violence and burning, an element not usually associated with natural disaster. Some archaeologists propose that Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland seized the weakened Minoan world, gradually taking control of their palaces and infrastructure. If this is true, then the Minoan disappearance might not have been a single event, but a slow unraveling, where nature struck first and invading forces struck later. Still, even this explanation does not fully capture the quietness of their vanishing. After the final abandonment of their palaces, The Minoans seem to fade into Mycenaean culture without conflict recorded, without written accounts, without a clear line of continuity. They slip out of history as softly as they once glided across the seas. Their unique language disappears. Their art style becomes absorbed and transformed. Their religious symbols linger for a time, then dissolve. It is as if their entire cultural identity was gently folded into another, leaving us unsure where one ended and the other began. Yet the Minoans remain powerfully present in myth. The legend of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, the tale of Daedalus and Icarus, the stories of Theseus, all may have echoes in Minoan culture. Their palaces truly were labyrinthine, with winding corridors and interconnected rooms that could easily inspire such imagery. Their bull-leaping rituals, where participants vaulted over charging bulls in elegant arcs, might have evolved into the mythic monster-human hybrid. But myth is not evidence. It is an echo, a shadow, a poetic remembrance rather than a factual account. Still, the stories preserve what archaeology cannot: a sense of wonder, a sense of something magical woven into the fabric of ancient Crete. When we walk through the archaeological ruins today, there's a gentle stillness that embraces the space. The once bustling courtyards are now open to the sky, warmed by the same Mediterranean sun that bathed them thousands of years ago. Broken frescoes remain vivid enough to show glimpses of the elegant life that thrived here. Young men and women painted in soft lines, dolphins swimming above doorframes, sacred symbols carved into pillars. It becomes difficult not to feel that the spirit of the Minoans still lingers in these fragments, like whispers caught between stone and sea breeze. The Minoan disappearance is more than a historical event. It's a reminder of the delicate balance every civilization must maintain. Even the most prosperous, peaceful, and creative societies can be swept away by forces beyond their control. A volcanic eruption, a shift in power, a change in climate, or a combination of all these elements can turn vibrancy into silence. And in that silence, questions grow. What did the final days look like for the Minoans? Did they sense their world changing beyond repair? Did they migrate inland or across the sea, merging with new cultures until their distinct identity blurred? Did they leave willingly, or were they forced by circumstances too immense to resist? Each possibility adds a layer of softness to the mystery, inviting contemplation rather than conclusion. What is most poetic about the Minoans is that they left behind so much beauty, yet so few answers. They gifted the world stunning art, refined architecture, and symbols that still captivate us. And yet, the most important pieces of their story, their language, their beliefs, their understanding of the world, remain locked behind the undeciphered script of Linear A. It is as though they chose to speak to us only through images and silence, allowing the imagination to fill in the spaces between. As this deep dive gently closes, we carry with us the image of Minoan Crete: sunlit courts, vibrant murals, winding halls, and the faint echo of the sea that once carried their ships to distant horizons. Their disappearance, like the ebb of a tide, reminds us that history often unfolds in patterns of rise and retreat, brilliance and quiet fade-out. With this soft mystery resting in our minds, we begin to drift toward another vanished culture, one tucked deep within South America, where mountain valleys cradle ruins that whisper of a people whose disappearance remains equally haunting. Soon, we will enter the realm of the Chachapoya, the Cloud People, another civilization veiled in silence and wonder. High in the mist-bound mountains of northern Peru, where clouds drift like pale rivers across jagged cliffs, the Chachapoya civilization carved out a world that seemed suspended between earth and sky. Known as the Cloud People, they lived in a realm where sunlight breaks softly through fog and where valleys remain hidden beneath blankets of silver-white mist. Their architecture clung to impossible slopes, their tombs perched on ledges humans rarely dared to stand upon, and their culture thrived in places where visibility itself becomes fluid and uncertain. And then, like the very clouds they lived among, the Chachapoya faded into near invisibility, absorbed, erased, or quietly dissolved into the passage of time. This deep dive takes us into that ethereal world, exploring the haunting beauty of their existence and the quiet mystery of their disappearance. To understand the Chachapoya, we must first understand their environment. The Andes in the Amazonas region rise steeply, forming narrow ridges and sheer cliffs that drop into dense, jungle-filled gorges. The air is thin, cool, and perpetually damp. Fog rolls across the mountainsides, giving the landscape a dreamlike quality. It was here, against all odds, that the Chachapoya built their kingdom. Their stone constructions, circular houses, towering walls, and massive citadels appear almost fused with the rocky terrain, as though grown rather than built. Their largest surviving settlement, Quilap, is often called the Machu Picchu of the north, but it holds a mood all its own, less sunny, more shrouded, more mysterious. Quilap rises like a fortress of clouds, its walls soaring as high as 60 feet in places. A narrow, funnel-shaped entrance forces visitors to ascend single file, a design that seems intended not just for defense, but for ritual significance. Inside, hundreds of circular structures form a maze-like interior. Some contain carved friezes, diamond patterns, and zigzags that echo Chachapoya artistry. Others hold remnants of grain stores, living spaces, or ceremonial rooms. Standing within Quilap today, surrounded by drifting mist and quiet stone, one feels a sense of calm isolation, a timelessness that reflects the Chachapoya worldview. Yet, despite the visual majesty of their structures, the Chachapoya left behind very few written records. Almost everything we know about them comes from archaeology and from early Spanish chroniclers, who describe them as fierce, beautiful, fair-skinned people with a strong warrior tradition and a deep spiritual connection to the land. Their mummies, preserved naturally by the cool mountain climate, reveal individuals wrapped carefully, placed in cliffside tombs that overlook valleys from impossible heights. These burial sites, such as the sarcophagi of Karagia, are among the most striking features of their culture. Tall, human-like statues encase the remains, painted with expressive faces that seem to watch over the landscape with eternal vigilance. But why did they disappear? And how does a civilization so unique, so geographically protected, simply fade? Like many Andean cultures, the Chachapoya eventually came under the expanding rule of the Inca Empire. The Incas, recognizing the strategic value of the cloud forests, launched military campaigns into Chachapoya territory. Although the Chachapoya resisted fiercely, they were eventually incorporated into the empire, sometimes through force, sometimes through negotiated submission. The Incas relocated many Chachapoya communities, scattering them throughout their vast empire to prevent rebellion. This relocation alone may explain part of their cultural dissolution. Dispersal weakens identity, and assimilation becomes almost inevitable. But the Inca conquest was not the end. Shortly after, the Spanish arrived, bringing with them disease, conflict, and political upheaval. The Chachapoya, already fragmented by Inca policies, suffered further losses. Epidemics ravaged the highland populations, and those who remained were absorbed into Spanish colonial society. Their language disappeared. Their traditions were suppressed or replaced. Their identity, once so distinct, slowly faded into the wider tapestry of Andean life. And yet, there is something unusual about the Chachapoya disappearance, something softer, more ambiguous. Unlike other civilizations that left behind records of dramatic decline or catastrophic destruction, the Chachapoya seem to have been gradually woven into other cultures until their uniqueness became faint. Even their descendants today often do not have clear lineage records, though many communities in the region still feel a spiritual connection to the ancient cloud people. Despite assimilation and time, the remnants of their world still speak to us. When archaeologists meticulously explore their cliffside tombs, they often find textiles remarkably preserved, tunics, bags, and wrappings woven with intricate geometric patterns. These items reveal a people with a refined sense of aesthetics, using color and form to reflect their environment. Their pottery, though less elaborate than that of coastal cultures, carries symbols and shapes echoing nature. Spirals like swirling mist, lines like mountain ridges, dots like falling rain. Each artifact feels purposeful, connected to both daily life and spiritual belief. Their geography played both protector and adversary. The steep, cloud-covered mountains shielded their culture for centuries, but once external forces arrived, the same rugged terrain made centralized defense nearly impossible. Communities were scattered across isolated ridges and valleys, unable to unite quickly against invading powers. Over time, separation became fragmentation, and fragmentation became disappearance. Yet even this disappearance is not absolute. It is more like a blending, a gentle merging of identities. As we look across the remains of Quilap or the statues of Karagia, we sense that the Chachapoya did not vanish in a moment of calamity. Their disappearance feels more like a slow dissolution into the mists they lived among. They became part of the landscape, part of the mountain fog, part of the cultural memory that still lingers in the region. Their story is quiet, serene, and imbued with the softness of clouds drifting across ancient stone. The Chachapoya remind us that not all vanishings are sudden. Some cultures fade like a whispered breath, leaving behind ruins that feel less like tombs and more like gentle echoes. Their world, beautiful, fragile, elevated, continues to inspire awe. It asks us to imagine life lived above the clouds, to picture rituals held beneath drifting mist, and to reflect on how a culture can be lost not through destruction, but through the gradual passing of time. With this tranquil mystery resting in our minds, we now move toward another disappearance, one tied to the deserts of the American Southwest, where a cliff-dwelling society once flourished and then slipped quietly into obscurity. The story of the ancestral Puebloans awaits, carrying its own blend of history, silence, and lingering questions. In the vast expanse of the American Southwest, where red stone mesas rise like ancient guardians and deep canyons cut into the land with quiet authority, the ancestral Puebloans built a world that seems almost impossible in its elegance and precision. Their homes clung to cliff alcoves hundreds of feet above the desert floor, protected by the very landscape they carved into. These dwellings, intricate, interconnected, and masterfully engineered, stand today as some of the most iconic archaeological sites in North America. And yet, despite their sophistication, despite generations of life built into these stone shelters, the people who once inhabited them left suddenly. Entire communities, once vibrant with daily rhythms, went silent as though time had simply paused and never resumed. This section takes us gently into that mystery, exploring how a thriving culture walked away from its sky-high cities and disappeared into history's quiet spaces. To imagine the world of the ancestral Puebloans, we must picture the land itself. The desert light shifts with a soft, golden hue at dawn, illuminating towering cliffs and winding canyons. Water trickles through seasonal streams, carving pathways that have existed for thousands of years. In this dramatic yet peaceful environment, the Puebloans perfected a way of living that was both practical and spiritually rich. Their cliff dwellings, like those at Mesa Verde, were not simple shelters but architectural marvels. Multi-story homes, ceremonial kivas, storage rooms, and defensive towers all tucked into natural alcoves that shielded them from wind, sun, and rain. Inside these dwellings, daily life flowed with a calm, communal rhythm. Families shared tasks of farming, weaving, and pottery making. Corn, beans, and squash grew in terraced fields below the cliffs, nourished by sophisticated water management techniques. Pottery was finely crafted and decorated with geometric patterns that seemed to echo the desert's own natural shapes, spirals like swirling dust, lines like canyon walls, and patterns that some believe carried symbolic meaning. The people were resourceful, resilient, and deeply connected to the land. And then, beginning around the late 1200s, something changed. Within a remarkably short period, the cliff dwellings were abandoned. Rooms that once echoed with the soft footsteps of children and the steady work of families grew still. Tools were left behind. Pottery remained on shelves. Kivas, which once hosted ceremonies and gatherings, went cold. The people did not die there. They simply left. The question that has lingered for centuries is why. Many theories have emerged, some grounded in environmental science, others in social dynamics, and still others in spiritual belief. One of the leading explanations involves a prolonged drought that struck the region during the 13th century. Tree ring records, silent historians etched into wood, show a period of intense, extended dryness. Water would have become scarce. Crops might have failed repeatedly. Communities that relied on careful farming and efficient water storage would have struggled to survive such harsh conditions. Yet, drought alone does not fully explain the abruptness with which the settlements were deserted. These were people who had lived in the region for centuries, enduring cycles of dry and wet years before. If water truly failed, why did entire cliff cities empty rather than slowly shrink? Why did they not rebuild elsewhere within the same canyon systems? These questions guide researchers toward deeper layers of possibility. Another explanation is social stress. Archaeological evidence suggests growing tension and possible conflict between neighboring groups during this time. Defensive structures appear in previously peaceful areas. Settlements become more compact and fortified. The cliff dwellings themselves, though architecturally beautiful, were also strategically positioned. They're difficult to access, offering security as well as shelter. If conflicts escalated because of shrinking resources or shifting alliances, the ancestral Puebloans may have chosen to abandon their cliff homes not because they lacked resilience, but because the region no longer felt safe or sustainable. Spiritual interpretations also form part of the discussion. For many indigenous communities of the region today, descendants of the Puebloans, the idea of a migration is not unusual, but expected. Movement, they say, was often guided by signs, visions, or cycles of renewal. The disappearance, from this perspective, may not have been a failure, but a transition, a purposeful migration to new regions where balance could be restored. Pueblo oral traditions emphasize connection to land, ancestors, and cosmic cycles. Leaving a place was sometimes part of maintaining harmony. When we stand inside the cliff dwellings today, these layered possibilities seem to drift through the air like desert dust. The rooms are silent yet filled with questions. The ceilings are blackened from ancient fires. The plastered walls still show fingerprints of the builders. Pottery fragments lie scattered like quiet reminders of those who lived, worked, and dreamed here. The emptiness feels heavy, but also deeply peaceful, as though the people left with intention rather than panic. One of the most mysterious aspects of this disappearance is that the ancestral Puebloans did not vanish entirely. Their descendants live today in the modern Pueblo tribes of New Mexico and Arizona, Hopi, Zuni, and others, who trace their lineage back through stories, symbols, and spiritual traditions. To them, the migration was part of a larger journey, not an ending. The cliff dwellings may have been left behind, but the culture continued in new forms, carried in memory rather than architecture. Still, from a historical perspective, the suddenness of the abandonment remained striking. Entire regions emptied, entire networks dissolved, and the exact reasons remain unclear. The cliff dwellings stand as a poignant reminder that even the most secure-looking societies can shift dramatically when environmental, social, and spiritual factors converge. Their disappearance is not a single event, but a convergence of pressures and choices. The ancestral Puebloans also teach us something about resilience. They survived for centuries in a desert landscape that demanded adaptability and cooperation. Their disappearance from the cliffs is not a story of collapse, but of movement, a migration toward new possibilities. Their descendants preserve their traditions, ceremonies, and worldview, keeping the spirit of the cliff dwellers alive, even as their stone homes remain silent. As we leave the red canyons and sunlit alcoves behind, we carry with us the image of those empty dwellings, beautiful, serene, and perched between earth and sky. They remind us that not all vanishings are dramatic. Some are quiet departures guided by a sense of necessity or destiny. The desert, with its vast horizons and timeless stillness, echoes their story gently. With this sense of contemplative silence lingering around us, we now turn toward another enigma, one shaped not by cliffs or clouds, but by dense jungles where stone cities rise like forgotten dreams. Ahead lies the story of the Olmecs, one of the earliest and most influential cultures of Mesoamerica, whose disappearance remains no less mysterious than their colossal stone heads. In the humid lowlands of ancient Mesoamerica, where jungles grow thick and rivers weave through marshy plains, the Olmec civilization once flourished with a quiet power that feels almost mythic today. Often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs shaped ideas, symbols, and traditions that would echo through later civilizations such as the Maya and Aztec. Their colossal stone heads, with expressions carved in deep, contemplative lines, watch over the remnants of their world like timeless sentinels. Yet despite their influence, despite their creativity and surprising sophistication, the Olmecs vanished with a suddenness that still puzzles historians. Their cities emptied, their monuments were toppled or abandoned. The jungle crept inward, reclaiming what they left behind. This deep dive gently guides us through their mystery, exploring a culture whose silence remains as intriguing as its rise. To imagine the Olmecs, we must step into a world where rivers were highways, where trade flowed along waterways and footpaths, and where dense forests provided both challenge and abundance. Their main centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, were more than simple settlements. They were ceremonial hubs, political capitals, and artistic heartlands. These cities were connected through complex systems of influence and shared iconography, suggesting a society with strong leadership and clear cultural cohesion. One of the defining features of the Olmecs is their art, which feels strikingly modern despite being over 3,000 years old. The colossal heads, some weighing more than 20 tons, are carved with remarkable precision. Each face appears individualized, with unique headgear, expressions, and features. These sculptures likely represented rulers, immortalizing leaders in a way that blends realism with spiritual significance. Their craftsmanship also extends to jade figurines, intricate masks, and symbolic motifs, jaguars, serpents, flame-like eyebrows, that hint at a deeply spiritual worldview woven into every creation. This spiritual dimension becomes even more evident when we explore the Olmec ceremonial complexes. La Venta, for example, reveals a sophisticated city plan aligned with astronomical observations. Mounds, plazas, altars, and basalt columns were arranged with intention, suggesting rituals tied to cosmology, kingship, and a natural world. Beneath some structures, archaeologists found carefully arranged mosaics made of polished serpentine blocks, offerings buried with deliberate care, never meant to be seen again. These hidden artworks suggest that the Olmecs valued spiritual harmony as much as outward display, creating beauty as both a gift to the gods and a symbol of power. And then, at the height of their cultural development, the Olmecs began to disappear. San Lorenzo, their first major center, declined sharply around 900 BCE. La Venta rose in prominence after that, only to experience its own sudden abandonment around 400 BCE. What is especially mysterious is that these declines were not slow dissolutions. They were rapid, almost abrupt. Monuments were intentionally defaced. Structures were dismantled. It was as if someone wanted to erase the symbols of authority or perhaps reset the spiritual landscape entirely. Why would a successful, influential civilization dissolve so quickly? One possibility lies in environmental change. The region the Olmecs inhabited is prone to river shifts, flooding, and the unpredictable behavior of water systems that communities relied on for transportation and agriculture. Archaeological evidence suggests that significant changes in river courses may have disrupted access to fertile land, trade routes, and stable living environments. If key rivers moved or became unreliable, the economic heart of Olmec society could have been weakened. This alone might explain why major centers lost their vitality. Another theory points toward political upheaval. The deliberate defacement of monuments, especially colossal heads and altars, hints at internal conflict or revolt. The symbolic destruction of ruling imagery often reflects a shift in power or a rejection of old leadership. Some researchers believe that the Olmec political structure may have collapsed from within, perhaps due to tension between elites or regional factions. The swift abandonment of ceremonial complexes suggests coordinated social change rather than gradual decline. Climate change is also part of the puzzle. Geological and paleobotanical studies show shifts in rainfall patterns and periods of drought that might have strained agricultural systems. Tropical environments are especially sensitive to climate fluctuations and crops integral to Olmec life. Maize, cacao, and others would have suffered. Food shortages can destabilize even the strongest societies, especially those with centralized power. Trade disruption offers another clue. The Olmecs maintained vast exchange networks that connected them with distant regions. They traded jade, obsidian, rubber, pottery, and cultural symbols. If these networks fractured due to external pressures, conflicts, or changing economic priorities, the Olmec centers may have lost their regional importance. Without trade, influence wanes. Without influence, power structures weaken. Yet even with these plausible explanations, a quiet sense of mystery remains. How does a culture so foundational simply dissolve without leaving behind clear accounts of what happened? Unlike later civilizations, the Olmecs left no deciphered written language. Their voices exist only through symbols, jaguar motifs, stylized faces, celestial patterns carved into stone. And symbols, while evocative, do not tell us the full story. Even more intriguing is the evidence that Olmec ideas lived on long after their cities fell silent. Later Mesoamerican cultures adopted many Olmec symbols, deities, and artistic styles. The concept of the feathered serpent, the importance of jaguar imagery, the use of jade in ritual contexts, all have roots traceable to Olmec tradition. It is as if the Olmecs vanished physically, but their spiritual and artistic legacy diffused outward like ripples from a stone cast into water. Walking through the remnants of Olmec sites today, one feels an unusual stillness. The humid air carries the scent of foliage layered across centuries. The stones are warm, softened by time and moss. The colossal heads emerge from the ground like ancient guardians who refuse to reveal their secrets. There is serenity here, but also a sense of unfinished narrative, an impression that the Olmecs left not out of catastrophe alone, but through a combination of environmental shifts, social transformations, and cultural evolution. Their disappearance is not a blank ending, but a transition. The Olmecs may have dispersed into smaller regional groups, blending into the populations that followed. Their traditions likely continued in countless subtle forms, rituals, symbols, myths that influenced generations long after their cities fell quiet. In this way, the Olmecs are both a vanished people and an ever-present foundation. As we leave the humid lowlands and the towering stone heads behind, we carry forward the impression of a civilization both powerful and enigmatic. Their silence speaks not of failure, but of the shifting, cyclical nature of human history, where cultures rise, evolve, transform, and sometimes fade into the gentle folds of memory. With this reflective mystery settling softly in our thoughts, we now move toward a different landscape, one shaped by islands, winds, and the vastness of the Pacific. Ahead lies the story of the Lapita people, skilled navigators whose disappearance from certain regions is intertwined with the ocean itself. Far out in the blue immensity of the Pacific, where the horizon dissolves into a single smooth line of water and sky. The Lapita people once moved with a confidence and grace that feels almost unbelievable today. They were master navigators, seafarers who crossed distances that would challenge even modern vessels. Their journeys stitched together a map of islands stretching thousands of miles, creating one of the most expansive migrations in human history. The Lapita left behind intricately patterned pottery, traces of stilted houses built over lagoons, and genetic footprints scattered like soft echoes across Oceania. And yet, at the height of their spread, their cultural identity began to fade, dissolving into the broader tapestry of Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian traditions. This section drifts gently through their story, exploring how a people capable of such extraordinary movement could vanish from the record with such quiet subtlety. To picture the Lapita world, imagine the early Pacific not as empty ocean, but as a vast, interconnected highway. The stars were their compass. The swell of the waves was their map. The flight patterns of birds, the color of the water, the scent of distant land carried on the wind. These were their guides. With double-hulled canoes carved from sturdy wood and reinforced by lashings of fiber, they traveled with families, supplies, animals, and plants necessary for life beyond familiar shores. Each voyage was not a gamble, but a calculated act of skill and knowledge refined over generations. Their pottery remains the most iconic evidence of their presence. Lapita ceramics are adorned with intricate designs, dots, spirals, triangles, and sweeping geometric motifs pressed into wet clay using small toothed stamps. These patterns feel almost hypnotic, evoking both artistic creativity and symbolic meaning. Archaeologists often refer to Lapita pottery as a cultural signature, for wherever these fragments appear, they mark the path of expansion across the Pacific, from the coasts of Papua New Guinea to the islands of Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. Yet pottery is not the full story. The Lapita people built stilt houses elegantly perched over shallow lagoons, allowing them access to both land and sea. They harvested fish, shellfish, and taro. They cultivated plants carried with them in their canoes. Their settlements reveal both careful planning and adaptability, the ability to build thriving life on small islands that would challenge many other cultures. Their navigation skills were unmatched, but so too was their understanding of how to live in harmony with fragile island ecosystems. And then, around 500 BCE, something shifted. The Lapita identity, so clearly recorded in their pottery and settlement patterns, began to disappear. The pottery styles changed first, becoming simpler, then fading entirely. The stilt houses vanished from coastal zones. The uniform patterns of Lapita culture dissolved into a more localized patchwork of island-specific traditions. It was as though the once coherent cultural thread loosened, frayed, and finally blended quietly into new forms. Why did this happen? Unlike civilizations tied to large cities or monumental architecture, the Lapita were highly mobile. Mobility both unified them and ultimately scattered them. Once they spread across thousands of miles of ocean, communities became naturally isolated. Winds, currents, and long distances created separation. Over generations, each island group developed its own customs, languages, and social structures. The shared identity of Lapita slowly transformed into the foundations of what would become Polynesian, Micronesian, and certain Melanesian cultures. Environmental challenges may also have played a role. Island life is delicate. A single storm can reshape coastlines, ruin crops, or force migrations. Volcanic eruptions, changes in sea levels, or resource pressures could have made some early Lapita settlements unsustainable. People may have moved inland or shifted to new islands, adapting and blending as they traveled. Another layer of the mystery involves social change. As populations expanded and diversified, leadership structures likely evolved. New hierarchies, rituals, and cultural markers took shape. The distinctive Lapita pottery, once a central unifying art form, may have lost its importance as communities reorganized around new priorities. Pottery, after all, is fragile. Its absence in later periods does not necessarily reflect a disappearance of people, but a shift in cultural expression. Some researchers propose that Lapita culture did not vanish at all. It simply blossomed into something greater. The rise of Polynesian culture, with its sophisticated canoe building, long-distance voyaging, and deep spiritual relationship with the sea, can be traced back to Lapita roots. The Lapita did not disappear so much as transform, their influence hidden within the cultural DNA of the Pacific. When standing on the beaches of these islands today, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, the remnants of Lapita life feel subtle but present. Broken pottery shards rest beneath layers of sand. Shell tools and discarded fish bones lie in ancient middens. The sea whispers the memory of canoes that once crossed endless horizons. Even the genetic heritage of many island communities carries the imprint of those early navigators. What is especially poetic is that the Lapita disappearance mirrors the ocean itself, fluid, shifting, unable to be held in one form for long. They were not a civilization that built empires of stone or left behind towering monuments. Their legacy floats instead in patterns of movement, in stories passed down through generations, in a knowledge of navigation preserved by Polynesian voyagers who still read the sky and waves today. Their disappearance, then, is not a vanishing but a diffusion, an expansion so wide that the original form dissolved into countless descendants. Still, from the perspective of archaeology, the moment their pottery fades feels like a quiet door closing. The record becomes blurred, leaving us with questions that drift like currents. What did they believe? How did they view their extraordinary journeys? Did they understand that they were shaping one of the most remarkable chapters of human exploration? We may never know, but their trail, subtle yet expansive, remains one of humanity's great stories of courage, curiosity, and movement. As we leave the open blue of the Pacific behind, we turn next toward a vastly different landscape, an arid desert where an ancient empire rose swiftly and disappeared just as fast. Ahead lies the story of the Garamantes, a people of the Sahara whose ingenuity carved life out of sand before their presence faded into warm desert winds. In the heart of the Sahara, where the sun rests heavily on endless dunes and the horizon shimmers with heat, the Garamantes once built a thriving kingdom that defied the very environment surrounding it. Their realm rose in the Fezzan region of what is now southwestern Libya, far from the Mediterranean shores and the bustle of ancient empires. Yet the Garamantes were far from isolated. They created an oasis civilization that flourished for centuries, leaving behind mysterious traces of a society that mastered irrigation, desert engineering, and long-distance trade. What makes their legacy so intriguing is how swiftly their world seemed to fade, swallowed gradually by the sands that had once shaped their identity. In this section, we step gently into their story, bridging our previous journeys across ocean worlds toward a landscape where survival itself became an act of ingenuity. To imagine the Garamantes, picture agricultural fields blooming in places where rain rarely falls, and stone settlements rising from terrain that appears at first inhospitable to any form of sustained life. Their secret lay beneath the ground, an elaborate network of foguera tunnels, ancient irrigation systems that reached deep into subterranean aquifers. These channels, stretching for miles, tapped into hidden water reserves and transported cool, clear water to the surface. In the heat of the desert, these underground veins allowed the Garamantes to cultivate date palms, wheat, barley, and grapes. They created gardens where none should exist, transforming the unforgiving Sahara into a landscape of life and abundance. This mastery of water not only sustained them, but elevated the Garamantes into a significant regional power. They controlled key trade routes running between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. Caravans carrying gold, salt, ivory, and possibly even enslaved individuals passed through their territory. The Garamantes, positioned strategically, became intermediaries, traders, negotiators, and guardians of desert pathways that few others dared to cross. Their settlements, fortified and organized, reveal a society that was both efficient and deeply rooted in its environment. Yet for all their achievements, the Garamantes remain elusive in the historical record. The Romans wrote of them as desert raiders, swift chariot warriors who moved across the sands with astonishing speed before vanishing again into the dunes. Archaeology, however, paints a different and more complex picture. A stable urban society with stone architecture, cemeteries, workshops, and evidence of long-term habitation. These differing perspectives add to the mystery, leaving us uncertain whether the Garamantes were primarily warriors, traders, farmers, or something much more varied and adaptable. And then, almost as suddenly as they rose, the Garamantes began to decline. Their disappearance was not marked by dramatic conquest or catastrophic disaster, but by a slow, quiet unraveling. As centuries passed, the aquifers that fed their fog-era systems started to diminish. Climate shifts in the Sahara made the desert even hotter and more arid. The once reliable underground water sources no longer replenished themselves. Without water, the fields withered, the settlements became vulnerable, and the trade routes shifted toward areas with more sustainable resources. It is a disappearance marked by silence, the gradual retreat of a people who had long relied on delicate environmental balance. Their cities did not crumble in a moment of collapse. Instead, they emptied over time, leaving behind ruins that stand today as faint outlines against the sand. What remains feels both peaceful and haunting. Weathered stone walls, abandoned irrigation tunnels, and fragments of daily life slowly reclaimed by the desert. In many ways, the Garamantes' story reflects the fragile relationship between human ingenuity and natural limits. They achieved the remarkable, carving prosperity from one of Earth's harshest landscapes. Yet even the best systems can fail when the environment shifts beyond what human adaptation can sustain. Their disappearance invites reflection on how civilizations, no matter how resourceful, must remain in dialogue with the land that supports them. This gentle transition from the water-bound adaptability of the Lapita people to the desert resilience of the Garamantes prepares us for another shift in landscape and mystery. Ahead lies a society that existed in the shadow of great empires, yet remains almost invisible in the historical record. A culture perched along the rugged mountains and deep valleys of the ancient Near East. As we move forward, we enter the world of the enigmatic Hurrians, a people whose language, beliefs, and origins continue to puzzle scholars and storytellers alike. The Hurrians occupy a space in ancient history that feels both present and distant, like faint music drifting from a neighboring room, recognizable in tone but impossible to decipher fully. They emerged in the mountainous regions of the Near East thousands of years ago, shaping cultures, influencing empires, and leaving behind fragments of language, mythology, and ritual. Yet, for all their significance, their identity remains wrapped in a gentle obscurity. They appeared, flourished, mingled with powerful neighbors, and then faded into the tapestry of civilizations that followed. In this section, we linger with their story, allowing the mystery of their existence to unfold slowly, like the soft turning of ancient pages. The Hurrians first appear in records around the 3rd millennium BCE, inhabiting lands stretching from the northeastern regions of Mesopotamia up into the foothills of the Caucasus. Their world was one of towering mountains, wide valleys, and rivers that cut through rugged terrain. This landscape helped shape their culture, resilient, adaptive, and deeply intertwined with nature. Unlike the centralized empires that often dominate historical narratives, the Hurrians formed smaller states and kingdoms scattered across the region. These communities traded, negotiated, and sometimes fought with neighboring powers, weaving themselves into the currents of ancient politics without ever forming a single dominant empire of their own. And yet, despite their seemingly scattered identity, the Hurrians became influential cultural mediators. They interacted with the Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Hittites, and later the Mitanni kingdom, a Hurrian-led state that rose to remarkable prominence. Their language, non-Semitic and non-Indo-European, stands out as a puzzle piece in the linguistic landscape of the ancient world. Tablets written in Hurrian are rare, often incomplete, and usually embedded within texts of other civilizations. Their words survive like whispers, enough to suggest a rich linguistic tradition, but too fragmentary to fully revive. This sense of an almost lost voice adds to the mystery surrounding them. The Hurrians were present everywhere. Artists, warriors, musicians, scribes, priests, yet their own perspective is faintly recorded. Much of what we know filters through the writings of others, like shadows cast on a wall by flickering firelight. One of the most compelling aspects of Hurrian influence lies in their mythology and religious traditions. They introduced a pantheon of deities that later blended into other cultures. The storm god Tezhub, standing upon mountains with thunder in his hands, became a central figure in both Hurrian and Hittite religion. The goddess Hebet, radiant and powerful, was revered across multiple kingdoms. Their myths often revolved around cycles of nature, storms, seasons, fertility, harvests, all reflecting the rugged world they inhabited. Among the most intriguing discoveries is the Hurrian hymn to Nickel, considered one of the oldest known musical compositions. Found in Ugarit, inscribed in cuneiform, it offers not only lyrics, but also musical notation. Though scholars debate the exact melody, the mere existence of this hymn reveals a society deeply attuned to ritual, sound, and expression. To imagine the Hurrians singing these ancient notes under the dim glow of oil lamps creates a vivid, almost dreamlike picture of a culture that valued beauty and ceremony. But perhaps the most historically impactful chapter of the Hurrian story comes through the rise of the Mitanni kingdom. Around the mid-2nd millennium BCE, the Mitanni established a powerful state across northern Mesopotamia and Syria. Their leadership was Hurrian, their gods largely Hurrian, and their influence considerable. They were skilled horse trainers, diplomats, and warriors, forming alliances with Egypt and rivalries with the Hittites and Assyrians. For a time, the Mitanni stood as one of the dominant players in the region, a subtle reminder that even cultures that seem obscure today may have once shaped the course of history. The Mitanni's expertise with horses is particularly notable. Ancient texts describe trainers using detailed methods for conditioning, feeding, and guiding chariot horses. Some scholars believe these techniques influenced later Indo-European equestrian traditions. It is a curious twist. One of the world's great expansions in horse culture may have been shaped, at least in part, by a people whose own historical narrative is incomplete. Yet the strength of the Mitanni did not last. Pressure from expanding empires, especially the Hittites, and later the Assyrians, gradually weakened them. Political fractures, shifting alliances, and military losses eroded their power. Within a few centuries, they had been absorbed, their leadership displaced, and their culture diluted into those that succeeded them. This is where the Hurrian story becomes especially gentle and haunting, not a tale of sudden destruction, but of slow merging. Unlike cultures wiped out by catastrophe, the Hurrians did not vanish in a blaze of historical drama. Instead, they blended gradually with surrounding peoples. Their gods were adopted, their administrative systems borrowed, their language intertwined with others until it no longer stood alone. It is a disappearance through diffusion, quiet, almost peaceful, like mist dissolving into morning air. Even today, the traces of Hurrian heritage echo faintly in later cultures. Some scholars believe early Armenian and Urartian traditions may carry elements of Hurrian influence. Certain mythological motifs reappear in Hittite stories, while musical structures, artistic techniques, and even religious fragments echo their presence. They remain a ghostly thread woven through the broader tapestry of Near Eastern civilization. What makes the Hurrians especially compelling is how familiar and unfamiliar they feel at the same time. We can see them clearly in the writings of others, yet their own voice is distant. We know they shape the world around them, yet their internal narrative is only partially preserved. This contrast between presence and absence, record and silence, creates the kind of mystery that lingers in the mind. Their settlements, once thriving with life, now lie buried beneath layers of earth, their walls reduced to outlines and foundations. Excavations reveal pottery, figurines, tools, and tablets. Everyday objects that speak softly of a people who lived, worked, worshipped, and dreamed. In some sites, archaeologists uncover large palace complexes, suggesting that Hurrian elites participated in ceremonies, diplomacy, and governance on a grand scale. Yet without surviving architectural inscriptions, we are left to imagine the details. What these rulers looked like, how they spoke, what stories they told their children. It is this imaginative gap that adds depth to their disappearance. Unlike the sudden end of the Indus Valley or the abrupt collapse of the Olmecs, the Hurrians faded not through catastrophe, but through integration. Their identity slowly dissolved into those of their neighbors, forming new cultural combinations. One might imagine families adopting new languages, new customs, new gods, while carrying fragments of Hurrian memory quietly into future generations. As we reflect on their story, it becomes clear that disappearance can take many forms. Sometimes it is loud, marked by the fall of cities and the chaos of invasion. Other times, it is soft, marked by centuries of transformation so gradual that it becomes almost imperceptible. The Hurrians remind us that not all mysteries are dramatic. Some are gentle, subtle, and deeply human. Their story also bridges beautifully to our next journey, for the Hurrians existed in a world where mountains and valleys shaped identity, where borders were fluid, and where cultural blending created new forms of expression. From here, we gently transition to a different kind of disappearance, one set not in rugged highlands, but in the forests and shores of Europe. Ahead lies the story of the enigmatic Beaker people, a culture marked by distinctive pottery, sweeping migrations, and a mysterious transformation of ancient societies across the continent. Their movement, influence, and sudden shifts create another chapter of quiet intrigue, another civilization whose presence is felt but whose disappearance remains partly concealed in the long shadows of time. The story of the Beaker people begins not with a single homeland or a dramatic moment of emergence, but with a distinctive object, an elegantly shaped drinking vessel, flared at the top, rounded at the base, decorated with precise geometric patterns. These bell-shaped beakers, crafted more than 4,000 years ago, appear like scattered footprints across Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the British Isles, from the Rhine Valley to the far edges of Scandinavia. Their presence marks one of the most intriguing and widespread cultural phenomena of prehistoric Europe, a movement so broad in scope that it reshaped the genetic, social, and ritual landscape of an entire continent. And yet, for all this influence, the Beaker people themselves felt like a shadow, an enigmatic culture that spread, evolved, and ultimately dissolved into the societies that came after them. In this section, we move slowly through their story, unraveling how a culture recognized primarily through pottery could leave such a lasting, yet mysterious, imprint. Their rise was gentle, not the forceful march of an empire, but a soft migration of ideas, technologies, and groups of people. Their disappearance was equally quiet, a blending rather than a collapse, leaving behind more questions than answers. The earliest traces of Beaker culture appear around 2800 BCE, likely originating in the Iberian Peninsula. But from the very beginning, their expansion was not a simple movement of one group into new territories. Instead, it was a diffusion, a spreading of customs, artifacts, and practices that may have accompanied, but did not always require, the movement of people. Archaeologists debate to this day whether the Beaker phenomenon was a migration, a cultural wave, or a complex combination of both. This uncertainty is part of the hypnotic intrigue surrounding them. The Beaker vessels themselves were marvels of prehistoric craftsmanship, Made by hand, shaped with care, and decorated with patterns of horizontal lines, zigzags, and dotted impressions, these vessels served ceremonial, social, and perhaps spiritual purposes. They were often found in graves, suggesting they held symbolic meaning, maybe tied to feasting, ritual drinking, or rites of passage. Unlike many cultures where pottery styles changed slowly over time, beaker designs traveled quickly, appearing across distant regions in remarkably consistent forms. This uniformity hints at connections that spanned huge distances, as though communities across Europe were participating in a shared cultural conversation. Alongside the pottery came other markers of beaker culture: archery equipment, copper daggers, stone wrist guards, and finely crafted ornaments. These objects suggest a society that valued skill, precision, and perhaps the status that came with mastery of new technologies. The beaker people were among Europe's early adopters of metallurgy, using copper and gold for decoration and tools. Their burial sites reflect individuality. Unlike earlier collective tombs, beaker graves often contained single individuals, carefully positioned, accompanied by select grave goods. This shift hints at changing social structures, perhaps greater emphasis on individual identity, personal achievement, or clan-based hierarchy. But while their artifacts are clear, the people themselves remain elusive. Recent genetic studies have offered glimpses into their movement, showing significant migrations into regions like Britain around 2500 BCE. Before the beakers arrived, Britain was inhabited by Neolithic farming communities that built monumental structures like Stonehenge. After the arrival of beaker-related groups, the genetic profile of the population changed dramatically, suggesting large-scale movement or integration. Yet the cultural exchange was not one-directional. The newcomers adopted local traditions while introducing their own, blending into the landscape of beliefs and practices already present. This process, merging rather than replacing, captures the quiet essence of the beaker people. They did not conquer with armies or impose rigid systems. Their influence spread organically through trade, marriages, shared rituals, and the exchange of ideas. This slow diffusion created a mosaic of local variations. British beakers looked different from Dutch beakers, who differed still from Iberian or Central European beakers. They were connected, yet distinct, unified by style rather than a single identity. One of the most captivating aspects of beaker culture lies in the way they interacted with monumental sites. Stonehenge, famous for its great stone circles, was reinterpreted during the beaker period. Burials appeared nearby, and construction phases changed. It seems the beaker people integrated themselves in sacred landscapes rather than building new ones from scratch. This respectful engagement with existing structures adds a poetic softness to their story. They arrived not as disruptors, but as participants in ancient spiritual traditions, bringing their own meaning to places already heavy with memory. Their expertise with archery and metalwork also contributed to societal shifts. Copper daggers, though not as strong as later bronze weapons, symbolize status and technological advancement. Arrowheads found in graves suggest that archery had ceremonial as well as practical importance. Some archaeologists believe that certain beaker groups may have acted as long-distance traders, carrying materials like amber, copper, and gold across Europe. This network of trade would have facilitated not just economic exchange, but also cultural blending. Yet with all their influence, the beaker people do not leave behind a central story. No temples, no written language, no grand settlements preserved in stone. Instead, their legacy is spread across countless small finds: a pottery shard here, a copper blade there, a burial uncovered beneath centuries of soil. Their presence feels like a soft wind blowing across Europe, leaving delicate patterns in dust and clay. Their disappearance is equally subtle. Around 1800 BCE, the distinctive beaker style began to fade. Pottery designs changed. Burial customs shifted. Metalworking evolved as bronze became widespread. Rather than vanishing abruptly, the beaker culture was gradually absorbed into the emerging Bronze Age societies of Europe. Their identity, once marked so clearly by bell-shaped vessels and archery gear, dissolve into broader cultural currents. In Britain, beaker-influenced groups contributed to what became the Wessex culture. In Central Europe, they merged with the Unetice culture. In Iberia, their traditions blended with local practices, shaping the genetic and cultural foundation of later populations. It is tempting to imagine the beaker people as wanderers, travelers who carried their traditions with them and left quiet marks wherever they went. But it is equally possible that they were innovators whose ideas traveled faster than they did, spreading through trade and imitation. The truth likely lies in the middle, both movement and exchange, both migrations and inspirations. Their story invites us to reflect on how cultures spread, not just through dominance, but through attraction, through objects that captivate the eye, technologies that improve daily life, and rituals that resonate deeply enough to be adopted by others. Their pottery, though simple in concept, may have represented a shared identity that transcended regional boundaries. To hold a beaker vessel, with its textured patterns and balanced shape, is to touch something that connected people across thousands of miles. What makes their mystery so soothing, especially in the quiet setting of a sleep-friendly documentary, is the gentle nature of their rise and fall. There is no catastrophe, no dramatic abandonment, no collapse. Instead, there is continuity, change through integration, evolution through exchange. Their disappearance becomes not an ending, but a transformation. As we follow the fading threads of their presence, we arrive at a broader understanding of ancient Europe as a landscape of subtle, shifting identities. The beaker people remind us that history is often woven from small interactions rather than grand events. It is shaped by everyday choices: how to craft a vessel, how to bury a loved one, how to trade and connect and share. In the soft glow of this realization, we prepare to transition into the final section of our journey. The stories of vanished cultures, from the Saharan kingdoms to oceanic navigators, from mountain tribes to European artisans, have shown us that disappearance is rarely a single moment. Instead, it is a melody fading into silence, or a color blending into a broader palette. Next, we enter our closing reflection, where we gather the quiet lessons of all these ancient cultures, contemplating what their stories teach us about resilience, adaptation, fragility, and the enduring mystery of human history.